Good morning, and thank you all very much for coming to this very important event to discuss Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act. And I, along with my colleagues Barbara Lee of California and Raul Grijalva of Arizona, are extremely pleased to be joined today by Salman Rushdie, the president of the PEN American Center, former U.S. Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder, who is now the president of the Association of American Publishers, Orrin Teicher, who is with the American Booksellers Association, and Carla Hayden, who is the past president of the American Library Association. We're very pleased that these groups are with us today. These four organizations have been leaders in drawing attention to Section 215 of the Patriot Act and its dangerous implications for civil liberties in our country. And I want to thank each and every one of them for all of the very hard work that they have done on this issue. Now, let me be very clear, and I think I speak for everybody up here and everybody in this room. International terrorism is serious business, and in my view, the U.S. government and governments throughout the world must do everything that we can to protect our people from terrorist attacks and to effectively fight terrorism. But we can and must fight terrorism without undermining the basic principles and constitutional rights which make us a free country. We do not need legislation such as Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which allows government agents access to files of American libraries and booksellers without probable cause. We do not need legislation which makes Americans nervous as to whether the U.S. government will be looking over their shoulders in terms of the books that they are reading or internet sites they are visiting in a library. We do not need legislation which makes librarians and bookstore owners complicit with the government in spying on their neighbors. In the United States of America, with our history, with our Constitution, with our Bill of Rights, with our respect for freedom, we can and must do better than that. One of the exhilarating aspects of this whole struggle against Section 215 of the Patriot Act has been the massive amounts of grassroots activity that is taking place from California to Vermont and every place else in between. And I should add here that this opposition is not just coming from progressives like Barbara and myself or Raul. It is coming from conservatives as well and people in the political middle. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have written their representatives in Congress to express opposition to the Patriot Act and Section 215 and encourage them to co-sponsor H.R. 1157, the Freedom to Read Protection Act, which now has 152 bipartisan co-sponsors. Some of you may recall that when we offered an amendment on this issue on July 8th, as part of the Commerce, Justice, and State Appropriations Bill, we had 218 votes after the normal 17 minutes. Unfortunately, that number went down to 210, and we lost on a 210 tie after the Speaker kept the rolls open an additional 20 minutes in order to twist arms to get Republicans to vote against us. But the support for this legislation is very strong and very wide. Today, I'm very pleased to announce that over 180,000 Americans have signed a campaign for reader privacy petition expressing strong opposition to Section 215 and support for restoring privacy protections to the American people. The petitions have been collected by thousands of libraries and bookstores throughout our country. Today is the culmination of months and months of work by numerous organizations to draw attention to the civil liberties violations inherent in Section 215 of the Patriot Act. Not only do we have 180,000 Americans on record stating their opposition to Section 215, but we have 4 state legislatures, including Vermont's. Barbara, we're waiting for California. Get going on that. 352 municipalities all across the country, conservative and progressive, going on record in passing resolutions expressing their concerns regarding the Patriot Act. As many people know, on Capitol Hill just this very week, both the House and Senate are marking up 9/11 Commission legislation that has been introduced in each chamber. My strong hope is that in the process, Congress does not repeat the mistakes of the Patriot Act. And I would like to emphasize the great need to pass only carefully worded legislation with respect to civil liberties. So let me again thank all of our guests who are here today. And let me introduce Barbara Lee, Congresswoman from California, who has been a stalwart fighter for civil liberties in our country. Barbara, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief, and I just want to thank you for your leadership, Congressman Sanders. Thank all of our organizations and individuals who are here for really protecting democracy. That's what it's about. Congressman Sanders came out to my district last year, and we talked about this, and librarians, again, bipartisan, as he said earlier, are furious and understand the chilling effect of what Section 215 does. Many of you may remember, I remember COINTELPRO. You know, some may remember the McCarthy era. We know what this means. We know what it means. And so let me just say that this Patriot Act, you know, was passed in a blind rush. It's like so many bills here on in the House during this last few years. Section 215 does nothing to protect us from terrorism. Nothing at all. Like Congressman Sanders, I support a strong a response to international terrorism. We're marking up actually today some of these bills that have been presented. But when it comes to protecting civil liberties, when it comes to justice, when it comes to protecting democracy, I want to say today that this country, these individuals, these hundreds of thousands of individuals understand what that means. And they understand that democracy right now is at a turning point, and this is a defining moment. And we're going to move forward and continue to work to protect democracy, to make sure that we repeal Section 215, and really to make sure that in the age of Ashcroft, we do everything we can do to protect our constitutional freedoms. Many jurisdictions are just saying no to this. Many cities and local governments, many libraries across the country are just saying we're not going to comply with Section 215, and they run risks of, again, the John Ashcroft approach to clamping down on individuals and to violating the civil liberties. But they're very brave and they're very courageous, and I just want to salute them today and tell them that we're going to move forward here in Congress to make sure that we support their efforts to protect individual freedoms. The freedom to read, the freedom to research, the freedom to go on the internet, the freedom to think thoughts, to come up with analyses and positions and views is central to our democracy. And when you deny access to materials and books and documents and papers that create a diversity of thinking, what have we come to in this country? I really worry about where we are, and so I just want to thank all of you today for staying strong and being courageous and taking this on in the face of adversity and in the face of all of the un-American activities that are going on in our country against the individuals of the United States of America. Thank you again.
We thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Barbara Lee. Let me now introduce Orrin Teicher, who is here representing the American Booksellers Association, who have just done a fantastic job in terms of bringing us so many names on these petitions. Orrin?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Congressman. My name is Orrin Teicher. I am the Chief Operating Officer of the American Booksellers Association, the national trade association representing independent bookstores operating in all 50 states across the country. I'm here this morning standing in for our president, Mitchell Kaplan, who is literally en route from Miami as we speak. He may arrive at some moment, but he had in our business, he had a signing in his store last night and couldn't get here till this morning. This past February, 500 bookstores across the United States started to circulate petitions to be presented to Congressman Sanders and his colleagues, urging that the protections and the privacy of bookstore and library records that were eliminated by the USA Patriot Act be repealed. With our partners in the Campaign for Reader Privacy, we have collected today, Congresswoman, she left, close to 200,000 signatures. We've brought over today the ones that were collected from the state of Vermont, close to 10,000. The rest are over in Congressman Sanders' office. And we are pleased to present them to Congressman Sanders and the other congressional leaders of this fight for reader privacy. We chose this particular day, September 29th, because it falls during Banned Books Week, the national celebration of the freedom to read. Bookstores have long been committed to the cause of free expression. We are primarily, though, business people and cautious, usually, about weighing into political debates. And I can tell you from the experience in hundreds of stores, there was trepidation amongst bookstores when we first started to ask them to collect signatures on these petitions. But because bookstores feel so strongly about the importance of protecting reader privacy, we put the petitions out for our customers to sign. The freedom to read privately was under attack even before the USA Patriot Act. Carla Hayden will speak in a moment about the challenges to library privacy that date back to the 1970s. For us in the bookstore community, the fight began in 1998 when Ken Starr subpoenaed the records of Monica Lewinsky from 2 Washington, D.C. bookstores. Since then, subpoenas or search warrants seeking the titles of books purchased by individuals who have been under investigation have been issued to the Tattered Cover Bookstore in Denver, Colorado, Olson's Books and Music here in Washington, Arundel Books in Los Angeles, Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and Borders. All of these bookstores have fought the effort to invade their records and to protect their customers' privacy. In some cases, the police have dropped their demands. In others, the courts have quashed the subpoenas and search warrants or narrowed them to prevent the chilling effect on First Amendment rights. Our president, Mitchell Kaplan, can personally testify to the importance of this issue. 3 years ago, his store, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, received an FBI subpoena seeking the book purchase records of then-Senator Robert Torricelli of New Jersey, who was being investigated for alleged violations of campaign finance laws. The subpoena demanded all records related to the purchases of books by Senator Torricelli and 7 other individuals going back to 1995. Mr. Kaplan was in touch with us at ABA and at the American Booksellers Foundation for Free Expression for help, something he could not do under the provisions of the Patriot Act. We told the FBI that we would go to court to quash the subpoena. It decided then not to pursue it. The Patriot Act blocks any appeal, however, to courts by booksellers and librarians. To be clear, we do not claim any absolute right to privacy. We recognize that there may be unusual circumstances when appropriate law enforcement authorities may be able to convince a court of law in an open hearing to issue a search warrant to a bookstore and/or library. But Section 215 mandates that a bookstore or librarian turn over the information about specific titles that an individual may have bought from a store or borrowed from a library without the benefit of any due process whatsoever. Concerned about these limitations and mindful about the various attempts to seek bookstore records, bookstores overcame their reluctance and put out the reader privacy petitions that you see here today. We were astonished, frankly, by the response of our customers. People rushed to sign the petition and thanked us for giving them the opportunity to express themselves. Booksellers displayed the petitions in their front windows and found that people were coming in simply to sign their names. 500 stores in all 50 states, as we have said, have now collected close to 200,000 signatures urging that Section 215 of the Patriot Act be repealed. We promised our customers when we collected those signatures that we would present them to Congress, and we are proud to be able to fulfill that promise today. It is not just the bookstores and the libraries and publishers and writers who are urging Congress to restore the protections for reader privacy. The readers of America are demanding the right to read freely. Thank you very much.
Good job, Mark. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you, Warren. Let me now introduce Carla Hayden, who is the immediate past president of the American Library Association, and like the booksellers, they've done a fantastic job in arousing grassroots opposition to Section 215. Carla?
Thank you. Libraries are one of the building blocks of a free and open society. And when members of the public enter a library, for whatever reason, to pursue their own intellectual interests, to look up something that they just have a curiosity about, or just find out about subjects that they've heard about, no one should be examined or scrutinized by anyone, especially by the government. And the American Library Association supports the protection of confidentiality and the freedom that accompanies it. And we find that parts of the USA Patriot Act threatens all of these freedoms. In fact, we remember, Orrin, the 1970s and the FBI Library Awareness Program. And as librarians, we are interested in and we're committed to ensuring the safety of our fellow Americans. But it's time for the government to stop wasting its time on supposed security risks posed by any American that goes into a public library for research, for learning, or just for fun. The new and expanded authorities under the Patriot Act allow the federal government to investigate and to engage in surveillance of citizens and others without having to demonstrate any specific reason to believe that they're engaged in illegal activities, and to threaten the civil liberties guaranteed under the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The Patriot Act allows the government easy, very easy, access to activities of library users throughout the country, including their use of computers just to browse the web or even to check their own email. We think that the worst part, though, of the Patriot Act comes from the veil of secrecy that hides its purpose and the consequences from the public. A secret FISA court approves the orders that FBI agents now need to compel libraries to turn over their records. Librarians are bound by a gag order that prevents them from telling anyone, even their own governmental structures, their own boards, when patrons in their communities are being investigated. The USA Patriot Act seriously undermines not only our civil rights and liberties, but all of the things that we worked so hard for so many years. Now, over the past 3 years, the American Library Association has worked hard to limit the impact of this act on the civil liberties of our library users. And our efforts have coincided with an increased partnership with all people who are involved in this effort. But still, the Justice Department's secrecy over the use of the powers granted under the Patriot Act has blocked our investigations into this time and time again. Last September, shortly after he called librarians' concerns over Section 215 of the Patriot Act baseless hysteria, I received a phone call from United States Attorney General John Ashcroft. And during our conversation, Mr. Ashcroft assured me that the Justice Department had not used the powers granted under the Patriot Act to investigate people in libraries. But months after my conversation with Mr. Ashcroft, we learned that the Justice Department had used its power to snoop on library users just weeks after that wonderful conversation that we had. The Justice Department has continually refused to tell the public how many library patrons it's investigated since the act was passed. And when librarians filed the Freedom of Information Act request seeking information on the use of Section 215 powers, our requests were ignored, and they continue to be ignored. Besides the selective releases of information about the use of the Patriot Act in cases related to terrorism investigations for which Congress intended it, the Justice Department has been successful in its efforts to keep the American people in the dark about its use of the Patriot Act. Librarians have joined with concerned citizens across the country in speaking aloud our conviction that the USA Patriot Act has gone just a little bit too far. 4 U.S. states have passed resolutions decrying the most onerous, really, provisions of the Patriot Act. 356 localities across the country have passed similar resolutions, and librarians across the country have applauded these efforts. The amendments to the U.S. Patriot Act proposed in the SAFE Act will give government all the authority it needs to investigate specific individuals when it has a reason to believe that they're a terrorist threat. We want to join with others, and we have, to spread the word that it is patriotic to challenge the USA Patriot Act.
Thank you, Carla. And now let me introduce a woman who really doesn't need much introduction here in the halls of Congress. Patriot represented the district in Colorado for many, many years, and she is now the president of the Association of American Publishers. Patriot.
Thank you very much, Bernie. And I must say I'm very proud today to be standing here representing America's book publishers and standing alongside of representatives of the entire American book community, the American authors, the American booksellers, and the American librarians. This book community is saying our forefathers and foremothers got it right. They really understood when they drafted these wonderful documents how tempting it was for people in power to abuse their power very often against their own citizens. Yes, they should use that power to protect their citizens, but no, we shouldn't be using that power to protect those in power against their citizens. So it's a very fine line here, and we feel that Section 215 is once again one of those things where they have stepped over the line, and it's incumbent upon America's citizens to push back and say, no, that is not in the American tradition. The book community here is not new to this issue. You've heard some of the statements already. I have this gray hair, so I remember in the 70s and 80s when the FBI went on its library awareness thing, where they were out looking at the records of Soviet bloc citizens and questionable American citizens. I must say, as an American Congresswoman, I was surprised when, under the Freedom of Information Act, I got my file from the FBI and found out that I was a questionable citizen at one time in their viewpoint because they didn't like my positions on Central America. Interesting. So we have to constantly monitor and constantly push. During that library awareness area, over 37 states passed bills saying no. That just tells you how angry people get when you do this kind of thing. And then we remember, as book publishers, the fits that the FBI was having when Hunt for Red October was coming out. It just never stops. There's always something going on. And I could go on and on. You've heard all of that. Basically, I want to thank this wonderful congressman from Vermont, Bernie Sanders. He said something that I can't emphasize enough, and I'm going to say it again. Our hearts were broken this summer when his amendment went to the floor and it passed. And we were so excited. We were screaming so loud in our office, I'm sure they could hear it over here. And then what they did is kept the voting machines open for another 20 minutes, which is longer than the normal voting time, until they could twist enough arms to make sure he didn't win. And then, just as we were starting to get discouraged, we suddenly said, this should be very encouraging, because it really said that both sides of the aisle have gotten the message from the American public that they are tired of this. They understand this goes way too far. The book community has stood together and helped booksellers when they've come in after them. Orrin Tiger mentioned about the different times that bookstores have been subpoenaed, the tattered cover in my district of Denver. The book community has stood with those booksellers, and we have been able in every case to get the court either to narrow the subpoena, squash the subpoena, or back off. Under this foreign intelligence surveillance court that they've set up, no, we can't do that. So you just have to totally accept their evaluation that somebody is suspicious, they want to subpoena their records, and they want to find out what's going on. So we think Section 215 crosses the line. And we think that it is time that all Americans stood up and said, of course, we're not embracing terrorism. But if we don't have the freedom to express ideas in this free marketplace of ideas we're so proud of in this country, how can we tell the rest of the world that they should be having a free marketplace? And from the publisher's perspective, we are terribly concerned about how booksellers and librarians are treated, because if suddenly their patrons decide oh my goodness, I shouldn't be checking those books out, or I shouldn't be buying those books, then what would be the point of publishing those books? You chill the entire marketplace. You freeze the marketplace, and you really skew what kind of ideas are going to be exposed. That is not the American way. We're going to tell the world we're a free marketplace of ideas. That's what we're supposed to be. Jefferson would be proud that we're here, and I'm sure he's cheering us from down the street. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. It gives me a great honor to introduce our next speaker, who is arguably one of the best-known literary figures in the entire world. Salman Rushdie is here today as the president of the PEN American Center, but in his own life and in his work, he demonstrates, his existence demonstrates the importance of civil liberties, the importance of freedom of dissent, the importance of people being able to communicate ideas without having to worry about the consequences of those ideas. So, Salman, thank you so much for joining us today. Salman Rushdie.
It just occurs to me that one of the little examined consequences of Section 215 is that presumably there must exist not only a group of suspicious Americans, but actually also a group of suspicious books. Because otherwise, how could you judge what people were borrowing unless you had a whole lot of books on a kind of banned list? So what are those books? I mean, do we have... I can't quite get my head around the idea of, Al-Qaeda members skulking around Barnes and Noble, borrowing how-to manuals about how to, assemble bombs or hijack planes. Is that what we're worried about? Or is it, is it bad to read, I don't know, Slaughterhouse-Five? What are the books that would flag, the subversive nature of the reading activity? So, it gets very murky when you get into this. I mean, I'm here most precisely on behalf of the 2,700 writers who are the members of the PEN American Center, but also of thousands more writers, professional, semi-professional, vocational, recreational writers who share our concerns about the way in which government institutions are now nosing into what should be personal creative space and shrinking public access to information about that, about how the government is using these new post-9/11 powers. PEN, I think, has great authority to speak in this matter, because for over 80 years we've been working on behalf of writers and other people who have been imprisoned or persecuted for what they've said and written and what they've read. I have some knowledge of this both at this end as the presidency of PEN and also at the sharp end, as was mentioned. In 1989, the Ayatollah Khomeini issued what the Nobel laureate V.S. Naipaul called a very bad review. And fortunately that threat has receded, but it should be noted that in several countries, the publishers of this novel and people selling the books were subjected to very real threats and menaces, and in many cases, violent retribution. I mean, there were attacks on newspapers I think in New York State, and then on Cody's bookstore was firebombed in California, and there were other attacks around the world. And there are still countries which forbid the reading and even the possession of my books. Fortunately, that has not been the case in this country. The United States has led the world in promoting the kind of attitude to open exploration of ideas, which I have certainly tried to pursue in my work, and the same free exchange of information which PEN seeks to extend internationally. And we at PEN have seen over and over again how societies around the world are weakened when the freedom of individuals to seek information and to debate ideas is limited. We know from our own experience as writers lucky enough to live in open societies how those freedoms, when they are protected, fuel creativity and correct or prevent countless government mistakes or errors. And now we've been doing this around the world for protecting freedom of expression, but we are quite clear about defending or grappling with the impact of terrorism. Again, I know this institutionally as the president and also, personally. I did some grappling of my own. in this regard. And we, of course, I mean, I have good ground to deplore terrorism and to think that there's very good reason to do things to get rid of it. But we also grapple with the impact of anti-terror and national security measures, not just here, but around the world. We've seen it in, I mean, let's just name a couple of countries ad hoc: Turkey, South Korea. Countries which have claimed to be struggling with terrorist threats and which have passed anti-terror laws which greatly exceed their stated purpose and come to be used to consolidate power and cover up government misconduct and stifle dissent. Now, interestingly, the United States government has frequently been an ally of Penn's in challenging these abuses in other countries. And in the cases I've mentioned, was in fact an ally in opposing the use of, using the cover of anti-terrorist legislation to in fact bring in authoritarian legislation which served quite different purposes. So it's kind of ironic that an ally in those days is now the subject of this conversation today. Several measures enacted since 9/11, including the Patriot Act, in our view, contain elements that compromise core American values and put our country on shaky ground internationally. Some provisions have given federal authorities new power to monitor the daily activities of law-abiding U.S. citizens and residents and collect, as we've been hearing, information on personal associations and reading habits and so on. Others have weakened the power of the people to monitor what the government is doing in that regard. And some, in our view, violate basic human rights standards and principles which the U.S. itself has helped to formulate and which it has been promoting internationally. Now we have a moment where the Patriot Act is scheduled to expire and Congress has the opportunity to review and improve anti-terror legislation. And it's very encouraging to see in the 9/11 Commission guidelines which one hopes very strongly will be followed. In the report of the Commission, they say clearly that the burden of proof for retaining a particular government power should be on the executive to explain, A, that the power actually does materially enhance security, and B, that there is adequate supervision of the executive's use of the powers to ensure protection of civil liberties. In the case of Section 215, there are 5 questions which we believe go against these guidelines and need to be answered. Why does the government need the power to search records of people who are not suspected of being terrorists or agents of a foreign government? Why is it necessary that Section 215 orders be issued by a secret court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and not by courts where booksellers and librarians have the ability to challenge overly broad orders? Why is it necessary to impose a gag order that prevents law-abiding citizens from learning that their records have come under scrutiny? Why, with the growing use of the Patriot Act authorized national security letters that allow federal investigators to seek records without even securing FISA court orders, what guarantees exist that these searches receive any independent review at all? And finally, why can't the number of bookstore and library searches be made public? And there seems absolutely no security reason for these things to be happening. And let's just remember that the freedom to write begins with the freedom to read. I mean, I agree with Pat, it's great to be here with every part of the book industry, but there's a 5th part that's in these boxes, which is 200,000 readers. And the freedom to write begins with the freedom to read. Most of us owe our careers to local public libraries and bookstores, and to the individual librarians, teachers, and booksellers who encouraged us to ask questions and offered us both the materials and the space to pursue our answers. In many countries of the world, gifts like these are almost inconceivable luxuries. But here they are guaranteed by the First Amendment and library confidentiality laws and court decisions that have historically held in check the urge to seek investigative clues in the records of what people read. Section 215 undermines all these protections, and as these petitions make clear, readers are very worried indeed. And on behalf of these readers and of writers, I'd like to just add my thanks to Representative Sanders and to Barbara Lee, who was here earlier, and to everybody else on this panel. I mean, it's a great job getting these signatures together, but thank you especially for your leadership in addressing these concerns. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Last week, Assistant Deputy General said that libraries, they had actually used Section 215 or one of the provisions, and that they wanted to prevent libraries from becoming havens for terrorists, and that so they'd actually track one down in a library in New York. Could you address that?
Sure. I think it has already been addressed. There will be, under some circumstances, historically there have been ways in which the government can get information from libraries. But what everyone here is saying is that under Section 215 right now, government agents can get access to your reading records without having to demonstrate any particular reason that you are involved in terrorist activities. No probable cause. There is a secret judge situation in which, in fact, the judge has no option. I think sometimes the Justice Department say, well, it has to go through a judge. What they forget to tell you is that all that the FBI has to say is they're doing an investigation on international terrorism, and the judge has no option but to give them that warrant. So the answer is, if the government can make a case, Salman just made the point, we are all concerned about terrorism, but you just cannot go in without having probable cause, without explaining to an independent judiciary that you have reason to believe that somebody is involved in terrorist activity. Yes, sir.
Where does your legislation stand? And it seems to me that with the intelligence reform bill in the House, that looking to expand possibly government surveillance. So could you address that?
Sure. Well, the good news here is that not only do we have such wide bipartisan sponsorship for the Freedom to Read Act, but as was demonstrated when an amendment which crystallized that bill came to the floor of the House, we had a majority of members of the House. As you know, Section 215 has been sunsetted, and that was a very wise provision. Obviously, I would have hoped that I voted against the Patriot Act. That section should not have been in the first place. But what it does mean is that when we look at the Patriot Act again, it's not simply a question of renewing Section 215. It is a question of having to bring it up again if proponents of that concept want to do it. They're going to have to start from ground zero. And I am absolutely confident that we have the votes to defeat any effort to bring up a provision similar to Section 215. I don't expect much to be happening in the next 2 weeks on that particular section. Obviously, the issue right now is what is going to be going into the 9/11 legislation. Yes, ma'am.
Just a sideline question for Mr. Rushdie.
Okay, Mr. Rushdie.
What did you think about the recent detention of Cat Stevens?
Oh, Cat Stevens. What do I think about it? I quite enjoyed it. I do think that, you know, if we're in danger from Cat Stevens, then we're screwed. So I can't really believe that, you know, that the cat, you know, is the real danger that we're facing. But you know, he and I had a little run-in once before, and even though he now tries to pretend that he was misquoted and his views were taken out of context, let me assure you they were not. And he wasn't misquoted, he said it on television. And if you want to go and look up the records, you can find the film on which, the videotape. You know, I mean, he's just wriggling now, you know. I think record sales went down. And so, no, I mean, I just sort of had a little smile, you know. But I think, truthfully, it's silly, you know, that if Cat Stevens can't come into America, we must be in really bad trouble.
Okay. Okay, I think all of the speakers, and maybe Mr. Rushdie more than anybody else, told us the real struggle and the significance of what we are talking about today. Do not underestimate the importance of this issue. This has to do with whether real ideas will be generated, whether serious discussion will take place, whether people can be free to raise points of view without worrying that the government is looking over their shoulder. What we are talking about today is what the essence of what America is supposed to be, and that is a free country. And I just want to conclude by thanking everybody up here, Mr. Rushdie, the librarians, the booksellers, Pat, for doing just a tremendous job in fighting for freedom. We hear a whole lot of talk about freedom today. These guys are leading that fight, and I want to thank them all very, very much. Thank you all for coming.
We
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
You were great. Terrific. Thank you so much. Anything we can do.
I'll get the...
To learn more about Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act, log on to the Association of American Publishers homepage, publishers.org, or